Hi, and welcome back to Nightly Reads. I'm Jason, and tonight we're going to be continuing our read of A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. We left off following the professor and his nephew, Henry, as they depart on their journey to the center of the Earth. They just unraveled the mystery of what the old ancient runic text said of how to get to the journey or how to get to the center of the earth. So we're gonna start where we left off from last time. So we're starting on chapter 5 if you happen to be following along in the book or what have you. So let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 5, First Lessons in Climbing. At Altona, a suburb of Hamburg, is the chief station of Kiel Railway, which was to take us to the shores of the Belt. In 20 minutes from the moment of our departure, we were in Holstein, and our carriage entered the station. Our heavy luggage was taken out, weighed, labeled, and placed in a huge van. We then took our tickets and exactly at 7 o'clock were seated opposite of each other in a first-class railway carriage. My uncle said nothing. He was too busy examining his papers, among which, of course, was the famous parchment and some letters of instruction from the Danish consul, which were to pave the way to an introduction to the governor of Iceland. My only amusement was looking out the window, but as we passed through a flat of fertile country, this occupation was slightly monotonous. In 3 hours we reached Kiel, and our baggage was at once transferred to the steamer. We had now a day before us, a delay of about 10 hours, which fact put my uncle in a towering passion. We had nothing to do but to walk about the pretty town and bay. At length, however, we went on board, and at 10:30 were steaming down the Great Belt. It was a dark night, with a strong breeze and a rough sea, nothing being visible but the occasional fires on shore, with here and there a lighthouse. At 7 in the morning we left Cursor, a little town on the western side of Sealand. Here we took another railway, which in 3 hours brought us to the capital, Copenhagen, where, scarcely taking time for refreshment, my uncle hurried out to present one of his letters of introduction. It was to the director of the Museum of Antiquities, who, having been informed we were tourists bound for Iceland, did all he could to assist us. One wretched hope sustained me now. Perhaps no vessel was bound for such a distant land. Alas, a little Danish schooner, the Valkyrie, was to sail on the 2nd of June for Reykjavik. The captain, Bjarn, was on board and was rather surprised at the energy and cordiality at which his future passenger shook him by the hand. To him, a voyage to Iceland was merely a matter of course. My uncle, on the other hand, considered the event of sublime importance. The honest sailor took advantage of the professor's enthusiasm and doubled the fare. On Tuesday morning at 7 o'clock, be on board, said Bjarn, handing us our receipts. Excellent, capital, glorious, remarked my uncle, as we sat down to a late breakfast. Refresh yourself, my boy, and we will take a run through the town. Our meal concluded, we went to the Kjons Nye Tor, to the king's magnificent palace, and to the beautiful bridge over the canal near the museum, to the immense centapath of Thorwaldsen, with its hideous naval groups, to the castle of Rosenberg, and to all other lions of the place, none of which my uncle even saw, so absorbed was he in his anticipated triumphs. But one thing struck his fancy, and that was a certain singular steep situated on the island of Amak, which is the southeast quarter of the city of Copenhagen. My uncle at once ordered me to turn my steps that way, and accordingly we went on board the steam ferry boat, which does its duty on the canal, and very soon reached the noted dockyard quay. In the first instance, we crossed some narrow streets. We were met with numerous groups of alley slaves, with parti-colored trousers, gray and yellow, working under the orders and sticks of severe taskmasters, and finally reached the Vorfelser's Kirk. This church exhibited nothing remarkable in itself. In fact, the worthy professor had only been attracted to it by one circumstance, which was that it was rather elevated steeple started from a circular platform, after which there was an exterior staircase which wound its way to the very summit. "Let us ascend," said my uncle. But I never could climb church towers," I cried. "I am subject to dizziness in my head." "The very reason why you should go up. I want to cure you of this bad habit." "But, my good sir—" "I tell you to come. What is the use of wasting so much valuable time?" It was impossible to dispute the dictatorial commands of my uncle. I yielded with a groan. On payment of a fee, a verger gave us the key. He, for one, was not partial to the ascent. My uncle at once showed me the way, running up the steps like a schoolboy. I followed as well as I could, though no sooner was I outside the tower than my head began to swim. There was nothing of the eagle about me. The earth was enough for me, and no ambitious desire to soar ever entered my mind. Still, things did not go badly until I ascended 150 steps, and was near the platform, when I began to feel the cold rush of air. I could scarcely stand. When clutching the railings, I looked upwards. The railing was frail enough, but nothing to those which skirted the terrible winding staircase that appeared, from where I stood, to ascend to the skies. "Now then, Henry." "I can't do it," I cried in accents of despair. "Are you, after all, a coward, sir?" said my uncle in a pitiless tone. "Go up, I say." To this there was no reply possible, and yet the keen air acted violently on my nervous system. Sky, earth, all seemed to swim around, while the steeple rocked like a ship. My legs gave way like those in a drunken man. I crawled up upon my hands and knees. I hauled myself up slowly, crawling like a snake. Presently I closed my eyes and allowed myself to be dragged upwards. "Look around you," said my uncle in a stern voice. "Heaven knows what profound abysses you may have to look down. This is excellent practice." Slowly and shivering, all the while with cold, I opened my eyes. What then did I see? My first glance was upwards at the cold, fleecy clouds, which, as by some optical delusion, appeared to stand still while the steeple, the weathercock, and our two selves were carried swiftly along. Far away on one side could be seen the grassy plain, while on the other lay the sea bathed in translucent light. The Sound, as we call it, could be discovered beyond the point of Elsinore, crowded with white sails which at a distance looked like the wings of seagulls, while to the east could be made out of the far-off coast of Sweden. The whole appeared a magic panorama. But faint and bewildered as I was, there was no remedy for it. Rise up and stand up I must. Despite my my protest, my first lesson lasted quite an hour. When, nearly 2 hours later, I reached the bosom of Mother Earth, I was like the rheumatic old man bent double with pain. Enough for one day, my uncle said, rubbing his hands. We will begin again tomorrow. There was no remedy. My lessons lasted 5 days, and at the end of that period I ascended blithely enough, and found myself able to look down to the depths below without even winking. And truthfully, with some degree of pleasure. Chapter 6. Our Voyage to Iceland. The hour of departure came at last. The night before, the worthy Mr. Thompson brought us the most cordial letters of introduction for Baron Tramp, Governor of Iceland, for M. Picturson, coadjutor of the bishop, and M. Finson, mayor of the town of Reykjavik. In return, my uncle nearly crushed his hands, so warmly did he shake them. On the 2nd of the month, at 2 in the morning, our precious cargo of luggage was taken aboard the good ship Valkyrie. We followed and were very politely introduced to the captain to a small cabin with 2 standing bed places, neither well ventilated nor very comfortable. But in the cause of science, men are expected to suffer. Well, and have we a fair wind? Cried my uncle in his most mellifluous accents. An excellent wind, replied Captain Bjorn. We shall leave the Sound going free with all sails set. A few minutes afterward, the schooner started before the wind, under all the canvas she could carry, and entered the channel. An hour later, the capital of Denmark seemed to sink into the waves, and we were at no great distance from the coast of Elsinore. My uncle was delighted. For myself, moody and dissatisfied, I appeared almost to expect a glimpse of the ghost of Hamlet. Sublime madman, thought I, you doubtless would approve our own proceedings. You might perhaps even follow us to the center of the earth, there to resolve your eternal doubts. But no ghost or anything else appeared upon the ancient walls. The fact is, the castle is much later than the time of the heroic Prince of Denmark. It is now the residence of the keeper of the Strait of the Sound, and through that sound more than 15,000 vessels of all nations pass every year. The castle of Kronborg soon disappeared in the murky atmosphere, as well as the tower of Helsingborg, which raises its head on the Swedish bank. And here the schooner began to feel in earnest the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was swift enough, but with all sailing boats there was the same uncertainty. Her cargo was coal, furniture, pottery, woolen clothing, and a load of corn. As usual, the crew was small, 5 Danes doing all the work. How long will the voyage last? Asked my uncle. Well, I should think about 10 days, replied the skipper, unless indeed we met with some northeast gales among the Faroe Islands. At all events, there will be no very considerable delay, cried my impatient uncle. No, Mr. Hardwigg, said the captain, no fear of that. At all events, we shall get there some day. Towards evening, the schooner doubled Cape Skagen, the northernmost part of Denmark, crossed the Skagerrak during the night, skirted the extreme point of Norway through the gut of Cape Lindesnes, and then reached the northern seas. 2 days later, we were not far from the coast of Scotland, somewhere near what Danish sailors call Peterhead. And then the Valkyrie stretched out direct for the Faroe Islands, between Orkney and Shetland. Our vessel now felt the full force of the ocean waves, and the wind shifting, we with great difficulty made it to the Faroe Islands. On the 8th day, the captain made out Mygoness, the westernmost of the islands, and from that moment headed direct for Portland, a cape on the southern shores of a singular island for which we were bound. The voyage offered no incident worthy of record. I bore it very well, but my uncle, to his great annoyance and even shame, was remarkably seasick. His mal de mer troubled him the more that it prevented him from questioning Captain Bjarn as to the subject of Sneffels, as the means of communication and the facilities of transport. All these explanations he had to adjourn to the period of his arrival. His time meanwhile was spent laying in bed groaning and dwelling anxiously on the hoped for termination of the voyage. I didn't pity him. On the 11th day we sighted Cape Portland, over which towered Mount Mandrill's Yokel, which, though weather being clear, we made out very readily. The cape itself is nothing but a huge amount of granite standing naked and alone to meet the Atlantic waves. The Valkyrie kept off the coast, steering to the westward. On all sides were to be seen whole schools of whales and sharks. After hours we came in sight of a solitary rock in the ocean, forming a mighty vault, through which the foaming waves poured with immense fury. The islets of Westman appeared to leap from the ocean, being so low in the water as scarcely to be seen until you were right upon them. From that moment the schooner was steered to the westward in order to round the Cape Reykjanes and the western port of Iceland. My uncle, to his great disgust, was unable to even crawl on deck, so heavy the sea was on, and thus lost the first view of the land of the promise. 48 hours later, after a storm which drove us far to sea under bare poles, we once more came in sight of land and were boarded by a pilot who, after 3 hours of dangerous navigation, brought the schooner safely to anchor in the bay of Faxa before Reykjavik. My uncle came out of his cabin pale, haggard, thin, but full of enthusiasm. His eyes dilated with pleasure and satisfaction. Nearly the whole population of the town was on foot to see us land. The fact was that scarcely any one of them but expected some goods by the periodical vessel. Professor Hardwigg was in haste to leave his prison, or rather, as he called it, his hospital. But before he attempted to do so, he caught hold of my hand, led me to the quarter deck of the schooner, took my arm with his left hand, and pointed inland with his right, over the northern part of the bay to where rose a high two-peaked mountain, a double cone covered with eternal snow. "Behold," he whispered in an awe-stricken voice, "behold Mount Snuffles." Then, without further remark, he put his finger to his lips, frowned darkly, and descended into the small boat which awaited us. I followed, and in a few minutes we stood on the soil of a mysterious island. Scarcely were we fairly on shore when appeared before us a man of excellent appearance, wearing the costume of a military officer. He was, however, but a civil servant, a magistrate, the governor of the island, Baron Tramp. The professor knew whom he had to deal with. He therefore handed him the letters from Copenhagen, and a brief conversation in Danish followed, to which I, of course, was a stranger. And for very good reason, for I did not know the language in which they conversed. Afterwards heard, however, that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the beck and call of Professor Hardwigg, my uncle. My uncle was most graciously received by M. Finson, the mayor, who was, as far as costume went, was quite as military as the governor, but also from character and occupation quite pacifist. For his coadjutor in Picturson, he was absent on an episcopal hard word episcopal visit to the northern portion of the diocese, which we were therefore compelled to defer the pleasure of being presented to him. His absence once was, however, more than compared by the presence of M. Fredrickson, professor of natural science in the College of Reykjavik, a man of an invaluable ability. His modest scholar spoke no languages save Icelandic and Latin. When, therefore, he addressed himself to me in the language of Horace, we at once came to understand one another. He was, in fact, the only person that I did thoroughly understand during the whole period of my residence in this benighted island. Out of 3 rooms of which his house was composed, 2 were placed at our service, and in a few hours we were installed with all of our baggage, the amount of which rather astonished the simple inhabitants of Reykjavik. Now, Harry, said my uncle, rubbing at his hands, all goes well. The worst difficulty is now over. How is the worst difficulty over? I cried in fresh astonishment. Doubtless, we are here in Iceland. Nothing more remains but to descend into the bowels of the earth. Well, sir, no, to a certain extent you are right. We only have to go down, but as far as I'm concerned, that is not the question. I want to know how we're going to be getting up again. That is the last part of the business, and it does not in any way trouble me. In the meantime, there is not an hour to lose. I'm about to visit the public library. Very likely I may find some manuscripts from the hand of Saknussemm, and I shall be glad to consult them. In the meanwhile, I replied, I will take a walk through the town. Will you not likewise do so? I feel no interest on the subject, said my uncle. What for me is curious in this island is not what is above the surface, but what is below. I bowed by way of reply, put on my hat and furred coat, and I went out. It was not an easy matter to lose oneself in the 2 streets of Reykjavik. I had therefore no need to ask my way. The town lies on a flat and marshy plain between 2 hills. A vast field of lava skirts it on one side, falling away in terraces towards the sea. On the other hand is the large Bay of Faxa, bordered on the north by the enormous glacier of Sneffels, and in which the Valkyrie was then the only vessel at anchor. Generally, there were 1 or 2 English or French gunboats to watch and protect the fisheries in the offing. They were now, however, absent on duty. The longest of the streets of Reykjavik runs parallel to the shore, and in this street the merchants and traders live in wooden huts, made with beams of wood painted red, mere log huts, such as you find in the wilds of America. The other street, situated more to the west, runs toward a little lake between the residences of the bishop and the other personages of not engaged in commerce. I had soon seen all that I wanted of these weary and dismal thoroughfares. Here and there was a strip of discolored turf like an old, worn-out bit of old woolen carpet, and now and then a bit of kitchen garden in which grew potatoes, cabbage, and lettuce, almost diminutive enough to suggest the idea of Lilliput. Pardon me. In the center of the new commercial street, I found the public cemetery. enclosed by an earthen wall. Though not very large, it appeared not likely to be filled for centuries. From hence I went to the house of the governor, a mere hut in comparison with the mansion house of Hamburg, but a palace alongside the other Icelandic houses. Between the little lake and the town was the church, built in simple Protestant style and composed of calcined stones, thrown up by volcanic action. I have not the slightest doubt in the high winds the red tiles were blown out, to the great annoyance of the pastor and the congregation. Upon an eminence close at hand was the national school, in which were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish. In 3 hours my tour was complete. The general impression upon my mind was sadness. No trees, no vegetation, nothing, so to speak. On all sides volcanic peaks. The huts of tuft and earth, more like roofs than houses. Thanks to the heat of these residences, the grass grows on the roof, which grass is carefully cut for hay. I saw but a few inhabitants during my excursion, but I met a crowd on the beach drying, salting, and loading codfish, the principal article of exportation. The men appeared robust but heavy, fair-haired like the Germans, but of pensive mien, exiles of a higher scale in the ladder of humanity than the Eskimos, but, I thought, much more unhappy, since with superior perceptions they are compelled to live within the limits of the polar circle. Sometimes they gave vent to a compulsive laugh, but by no chance did they smile. Their costume consists of coarse cloaks of black wool, known in Scandinavian countries as the vadmel, a broad-brimmed hat, trousers of a red serge, and a piece of leather tied with strings for a shoe, a coarse kind of moccasin, if you will. The women, though sad-looking and mournful, had rather agreeable features, without much expression. They wear a bodice and petticoat of sombre vadmel. When unmarried, they wear a little brown knitted cap over a crown of plaited hair, but when married, they cover their heads with a colored handkerchief over which they tie white scarf. Chapter 7. Conversation and Discovery. When I returned, dinner was ready. This meal was devoured by my worthy relative with avidity and voracity. His shipboard diet had turned his interior into a perfect gulf. The repast, which was more Danish than Icelandic, was in itself nothing, but the excessive hospitality of our host made us enjoy it doubly. The conversation turned upon scientific matters, and M. Fredrickson asked my uncle what he thought of the public library. "Library, sir!" cried my uncle. "It appears to me a collection of useless old volumes and a beggarly amount of empty shelves." "What?" cried M. Fredrickson. "Why, we have 8,000 volumes of the most rare and valuable works, some in the Scandinavian language, besides all new publications from Copenhagen." 8,000 volumes, my dear sir? Why, where are they?" cried my uncle. "Scattered over the country, Professor Hardwigg. We are very studious, my dear sir. Though we do not live in Iceland, every farmer, every laborer, every fisherman can both read and write, and we think that books, instead of being locked up in cupboards far from the sight of students, should be distributed as widely as possible. The books of our library are therefore passed from hand to hand without returning to the library shelves, perhaps for years." Then, when foreigners visit you, there is nothing for them to see? Well, sir, foreigners have their own libraries, and our first consideration is that our humbler classes should be highly educated. Fortunately, the love of study is innate in the Icelandic people. In 1860, we founded a literacy society and mechanics institute. Many foreign scholars of eminence are honorary members. We publish books destined to educate our people, and these books have rendered valuable services to our country. Allow me to have the honor, Professor Hardwick, to enroll you as an honorary member. My uncle, who had already belonged to nearly every literary and scientific institution in Europe, immediately yielded to the amiable wishes of the good M. Frederickson. And now, he said, after many expressions of gratitude and goodwill, if you will tell me what books you expect to find, perhaps I may be of some assistance to you. I watched my uncle keenly. For a minute or two he hesitated, as if unwilling to speak. To speak openly was, perhaps, to unveil his projects. Nevertheless, after some reflection, he made up his mind. Well, M. Frederickson, he said in an easy, unconcerned kind of way, I was desirous of ascertaining if among your valuable works you had any type of the learned Arne Saknussemm? Arne Saknussemm, cried the professor of Reykjavik. You speak of one of the most distinguished scholars of the 16th century, one of the great naturalist, the great alchemist, the great traveler. Exactly so. One of the most distinguished men connected with Icelandic science and literature. As you say, sir. A man illustrious above all. Yes, sir, all of this is true. But his works? We have none. None of them. Not in Iceland? There are none in Iceland or elsewhere, answered the other sadly. Why so? Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his works were publicly burnt at Copenhagen by the hands of the common hangman. Very good, capital, murmured my uncle, to the great astonishment of the worthy Icelander. You said, sir. Yes, yes, all is clear. I see the link in the chain. Everything is explained. I now understand why Arne Saknussemm, put out of court, forced to hide his magnificent discoveries, was compelled to conceal beneath the veil of an incomprehensible cryptograph the secret. What secret? A secret which, stammered my uncle. Have you discovered some wonderful manuscript? Cried M. Frederickson. No, no, I was carried away by my enthusiasm. A mere supposition. Very good, sir. But really, to turn to another subject, I hope you will not leave our island without examining into its mineralogical riches. Well, the fact is, I am rather late. So many learned men have already been here before me. Yes, yes, but there's still so much to be done, cried M. Frederickson. You think so? Said my uncle, his eyes twinkling with hidden satisfaction. Yes, you have no idea how many unknown mountains, glaciers, volcanoes there are which remain to be studied. Without moving from where we sit, I can show you one. Yonder. On the edge of the horizon, you see Sneffels. Oh, yes, Sneffels, said my uncle. One of the most curious volcanoes in existence, the crater of which has been rarely visited. Extinct? Extinct in any time these 500 years, was the ready reply. Well, said my uncle, who dug in his nails into his flesh and pressed his knees tightly together to prevent himself from leaping up and down with joy. I have a great mind to begin my studies with an examination of the geological mysteries of this Mount Cephal. Fezzle? What did you call it? Sneffels, my dear sir. This portion of the conversation took place in Latin, and I therefore understood all that had been said. I could scarcely keep my countenance when I found my uncle so cunningly concealing his delight and satisfaction. I must confess that his artful grimaces, put on to conceal his happiness, made him look like the new Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles. It's a big word with lots of syllables. Yes, yes, he continued, your proposition delights me. I will endeavor to climb to the summit of Sneffels, and if possible, I'll descend into its crater. I very much regret, continued Mr. Frederickson, that my occupation will entirely preclude me from the possibility of my accompanying you. It would have been both pleasurable and profitable if I could have spared the time. No, no, 1,000 times no, cried my uncle. I do not wish to disturb any serenity of any man. I thank you, however, with all of my heart. The presence of one so learned as yourself would no doubt have been most useful, but the duties of your office and profession before everything. In the innocence of his simple heart, our host did not perceive the irony of these remarks. I entirely approve of your project, continued the Icelander after some further remarks. It is a good idea to begin with examining this volcano. You will make a harvest of curious observations. In the first place, how do you propose to get to Snuffles? By sea. By sea. I shall cross the bay. Of course, that is the most rapid route. Of course, but still, it cannot be done. Why? Have we not an available boat in all of Reykjavik? Replied the other. What is to be done? You must go by land along the coast. It is longer, but much more interesting. Then I must have a guide. Of course. I have your very man. Somebody on whom I can depend. Yes, an inhabitant of the peninsula on which Snuffles is situated. He is a very shrewd and worthy man, with whom you will be pleased. He speaks Danish like a Dane. When can I see him? Today? No, tomorrow. He will be here. He will not be here before tomorrow. Tomorrow be it, replied my uncle with a deep sigh. The conversation ended by compliments on both sides. During the dinner, my uncle had learned much as to the history of Arne Saknussemm, the reasons for his mysterious and hieroglyphical document. He also became aware that his host would not accompany him on his adventurous expedition, and that the next day we should have a guide. Chapter 8. The Eater-down Hunter. Off at last. That evening I took a brief walk on the shore near Reykjavik, after which I returned to the early sleep on my bed of coarse planks, where I slept the sleep of the just. When I woke, I heard my uncle speaking loudly in the next room. I rose hastily and joined him. He was talking in Danish with a man of tall stature and perfectly Herculean build. This man appeared to be possessed of a very great strength. His eyes, which stared rather predominantly from a large head, the face belonging to which was simple and naive, appeared very quick and intelligent. Very long hair, which even in England would have never been accounted exceedingly red, fell over his athletic shoulders. This native of Iceland was active and supple in appearance, though he scarcely moved his arms, being in fact one of those men who despise the habit of gesticulation common to southern people. Everything in this man's manner revealed a calm temperament. There was nothing indolent about him, but his appearance spoke of tranquillity. He was one of those who never seemed to expect anything from anybody, who liked to work when he thought proper, and whose philosophy nothing could astonish or trouble. I began to comprehend his character simply from the way in which he listened to the wild and impassioned verbiage of my worthy uncle. While the excellent professor spoke sentence after sentence, he stood with folded arms, utterly still, motionless to all of my uncle's gesticulations. When he wanted to say no, he just moved his head from left to right. When he acquiesced, he nodded, so slightly that you could scarcely see the undulation of his head. This economy of motion was carried to the length of avarice. Judging from his appearance, I should have been a long time before I suspected him to be what he was, a mighty hunter. Certainly his manner was not likely to frighten the game. How then did he contrive to get his prey? My surprise was slightly modified when I knew that this tranquil and solemn personage was the hunter of the eider duck, the down of which is, after all, the greatest source of the Icelander's wealth. In the early days of summer, the female of the eider, a pretty sort of duck, builds its nest amid the rocks of the fjords, the name given to all the narrow gulfs in Scandinavian countries, with which every part of the island is indented. No sooner has the eider duck made her nest than she lines the inside of it with the softest down from her breast. Then comes the hunter, or trader, taking away the nest. The poor bereaved female begins her task over again, and this continues as long as any eider duck down is to be found. When she can then find no more, the male bird sets to work to see what he can do. As, however, his down is not so soft, and has therefore no commercial value, the hunter does not take the trouble to rob him of his nest lining. The nest is accordingly finished, and the eggs are laid, and the little ones are born, and the next year the harvest of the eider duck down is again collected. Now, as the eider duck never selects steep rocks or aspects to build its nest, but rather sloping and low cliffs near to the sea, the Icelandic hunter can carry on his trade of operations without much difficulty. He is like a farmer who has neither to plow or sow, nor to harrow, only to collect his harvest. Ooh, even I'm getting tired. This grave and sententious, silent person, as calm as an Englishman on the French stage, was named Hans Bjelke. He had called upon us in consequence of the recommendation of Mr. Frederickson. He was, in fact, our future guide. It struck me that I had sought the world over, and I could not have found a greater contradiction to my impulsive uncle. They, however, readily understood one another. Neither of them had any thought about money. One was ready to take all that was offered him, and the other ready to offer anything that was asked. It may be readily conceived, then, that an understanding was soon to come between them. Now, the understanding was that he was to take us to the village of Stapi, situated on the southern slope of the peninsula of Snuffles, at the very foot of the volcano. Hans, the guide, told us that the distance was about 22 miles, a journey of which my Uncle supposed to take about 2 days. When my uncle came to understand that they were Danish miles of 8,000 yards each, he was obliged to be more moderate in his ideas, and considering the horrible roads we had to follow, to allow 8 to 10 days for the journey. 4 horses prepared for us, 2 to carry the baggage and 2 to bear the important weight of myself and my uncle. Hans declared that nothing would ever make him climb on the back of any animal. He knew every inch of that part of the coast, and promised to take us the very shortest way. His engagement with my uncle was by no means to cease our arrival at Stapi. He was further to remain in his service during the whole time required for the completion of his scientific investigations. At a fixed salary of 3 rix dollars a week, being exactly 14 shillings, 2 pence, minus 1 farthing in English currency. One stipulation, however, was made by the guide. The money was to be paid to him every Saturday night, failing which his engagement was at an end. The day of our departure was fixed. My uncle wished to hand the eider-down hunter in advance, but he refused in one emphatic word, "efter," which, being translated from Icelandic into plain English, means after. Who'd have guessed? The treaty concluded, our worthy guide retired without another word. "A splendid fellow," said my uncle. "Only he little suspects the marvelous part he is about to play in the history of the world." "You mean, then," I cried in amazement, "that he should accompany us?" "To the interior of the earth, yes," replied my uncle. "Why not?" There were yet 48 hours to elapse before we made our final start. To my great regret, our whole time was taken up in making preparations for our journey. All our industry and ability were devoted into packing every object in the most advantageous manner, the instruments on one side, the arms on the other, the tools here and the provisions there. There were, in fact, 4 distinct groups. The instruments were, of course, the best ever made. A centigrade thermometer of Agel, counting up to 150 degrees, which to me did not appear half enough, or too much. Too hot by half if the degree of heat was to ascend that high. And if it did ascend that high, we would surely be cooked. But not enough if we wanted to ascertain the exact temperature of springs or metal in the state of fusion. A manometer worked by compressed air, an instrument used to ascertain the upper atmospheric pressure on the level of the ocean. Perhaps a common barometer would not have done as well, the atmospheric pressure being likely to increase in proportion as we descend below the surface of the earth. A first-class chronometer. A watch. Fancy word for a watch. Made by Bossinus of Geneva, set the meridian of Hamburg, from which the Germans calculate as the English do from Greenwich, and the French from Paris. 2 compasses, one for horizontal guidance, the one to ascertain the dip. A night glass, 2 Rukmaroff coils, which are induction coils, and have the means of a current of electricity, and will ensure us a very excellent, easily carried, and certain means of obtaining light. A voltaic battery on the newest principle. Our arms consisted of 2 rifles, with 2 revolving 6-shooters. Why these arms were provisioned, it was impossible for me to say. I had every reason to believe that we had neither wild beasts or savage natives to fear. My uncle, on the other hand, was quite as devoted to his arsenal as to his collection of instruments, and above all was very careful with his provisions of fulminating or gun cotton, warranted to keep in any climate, and of which the expansive force was known to be greater than its ordinary gunpowder. Our tools consisted of 2 pickaxes, 2 crowbars, a silken ladder, and 3 iron-shod alpine poles, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges, some pointed pieces of iron, and a quantity of strong rope. You may conceive that the whole was made a tolerable parcel, especially when I mention that the ladder itself was 300 feet long. Then there came the important question of provisions. The hamper was not very large, but tolerably satisfactory, for I knew what in concentrated essence of meat and biscuit there was enough to last 6 months. The only liquid provided by my uncle was shadam. Of water, not a drop. We had, however, an ample supply of gourds, and my uncle counted on finding water and filling enough of them as soon as we commenced. As soon as we commenced our downward journey. My remarks as to the temperature, the quality, and even as to the possibility of none being found remained wholly without effect. To make up the exact list of our traveling gear for the guidance of future travelers, add that we carried a medicine and surgical chest with all apparatus necessary for wounds, fractures, and blows, lint and scissors, lancets, in fact, a perfect collection of horrible cooking instruments. A number of vials containing ammonia, alcohol, ether, Gollard water, aromatic vinegar, in fact, every possible and impossible drug. Finally, all the materials for working the induction coil. My uncle had also been very careful to lay in a very goodly supply of tobacco, several flasks of very fine gunpowder, boxes of tinder, besides a large belt crammed full of notes and gold. Good boots, rendered watertight, were to be found, to the number of 6 in the toolbox. My boy, with such clothing, with such boots, with such general equipment, said my uncle in a state of rapturous delight, we may hope to travel far. It took a whole day to put these matters in order. In the evening we dined with Baron Tramp in the company of Mayor of Reykjavik, Dr. Highlightelin, and who is the great medical man of Iceland. M. Fredrickson was not present, and I was afterwards sorry to hear that he and the governor did not agree on some matters connected with the administration of the island. Unfortunately, the consequences were that I did not understand a word that was said at dinner. A kind of semi-official reception. One thing I can say, my uncle never left off speaking. The next day our labor came to an end. Our worthy host delighted my uncle, Professor Hardwigg, by giving him a good map of Iceland, a most important and precious document for a mineralogist. Our last evening was spent in a long conversation with Mr. Fredrickson, whom I liked very much, the more that I never expected to see him or anyone else again. After this agreeable way of spending an hour or so, I tried to sleep. In vain, with the exception of a few dozes, my night was miserable. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened from the only real half hours sleep of the night by a loud neighing of the horses under my window. I hastily dressed myself and went into the street. Hans was engaging in putting the finishing stroke of our baggage, which he did in a silent, quiet way that won my admiration. And yet he did it admirably well. My uncle wasted a great deal of breath giving him directions, but worthy Hans took not the slightest notice of his words. At 6 o'clock all our preparations were completed, and Mr. Fredrickson shook hands heartily with us. My uncle thanked him warmly in the Icelandic language for his kind hospitality, speaking truly from the heart. For myself, I put together a few of my best Latin phrases and paid him the highest compliments I could. This fraternal and friendly duty performed, we sallied forth and mounted our horses. As soon as we were quite ready, Mr. Fredrickson advanced, and by a way of farewell, called after me in the words of Virgil, words which appeared to have been made for us, travelers starting in an uncertainable destination. And whichsoever way thou goest, may fortune follow. All right, that is the end of chapter 8 and the end of our journey for tonight. I hope you like this reading of the last 4 chapters of A Journey to the Center of the Earth. Remember, if you like what's going on, be sure to hit the heart. Let me know what you like, what you don't like, and then subscribe and ring that bell so you'll be notified of the next 4 chapters. Thank you, and good night.